So hello and welcome everyone to PIBC's webinar, number 5, Ethics and Professionalism for Planners. My name is Sophie King. I'm the Professional Learning and Events Coordinator with PIBC, and I'm very happy to be your host today. This very popular and sold-out webinar illustrates how important a topic this is to our members and to planners in general. And now I am pleased to introduce our two speakers, Ken Cameron and Nancy Knight, both members of the Planning Institute of British Columbia's Professional Conduct Review Committee. Ken and Nancy will be presenting this webinar from our Vancouver studio. Welcome, Ken and Nancy.
Thanks, Sophie.
And the presenters will take questions at designated question periods. Please feel free at that time to type in your question in the chat window located to the lower right of your screen. If you prefer to send in your question privately, please send a private chat to the presenters, and they will address the question without anyone letting anyone know who it came from. Okay, so now we are ready to begin. Nancy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and welcome everyone today to this webinar on professionalism and ethics for planning. Ken and I are very happy to be with you today. We want to cover a range of topics with you today and also have an interactive Q&A session close to the end of the session today. We'll start with Ken providing an overview of professional self-regulation. I'm going to cover the bedrock of the Planning Institute's self-regulatory framework, which is our Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. Ken will then walk you through some issues that you might run into and what happens if the Institute does receive a complaint, how the complaint review process works. I will take you through some case studies, and then we will open it up for you to submit questions to us, which we will provide some feedback on as much as we can. And then Ken will close with some advice for you to keep in mind as you move forward in terms of dealing with ethical and professional challenges. We'll also provide you with some resources that you can consult on a day-to-day basis. This is the question card. We thought we'd put this up right now so that you can get in mind, and as you're listening to us over the next little while, you can think about ethical or professional challenges that you have experienced or heard about or witnessed in your professional career, and you can jot them down and send them in. Now, when Ken and I have run this at conferences, we generally find that people prefer to submit them anonymously because it deals with the current work situation often. So really encourage you to feel free to use that private confidential system that Sophie outlined to send in your questions to us. So just before I turn it over to Ken to cover the professional self-regulation background, we thought it would be useful just to touch on why we think it is that planners need to understand ethics and professionalism. We come from varied backgrounds as planners, and we probably therefore assign slightly different weights and priorities to values that we hold in common. In a professional planning setting, you have specialized knowledge, power in the process before, during, and after, information and experience about distributional effects, and a responsibility to ensure ongoing public trust and confidence in the planning system, as well as a responsibility to serve the public interest and responsibilities to our employers or clients. And so consequently, and those of us working in land and land use know that it's a fishbowl. It touches everyone. And so therefore it's very important to have a very good grounding in ethics and professional conduct to guide us as we move along. this next slide illustrates how some of those factors can overlap and push and pull us in different directions in our day-to-day practice. Sometimes these all line up and we're rowing in the same direction, and those are usually golden times in our careers, but it's not always like that. And you often have different factors pushing and pulling you in different directions. So we recognize this, and this is one of the reasons why we're interested in helping people get a better understanding of ethics and professional conduct. Over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Nancy, and welcome everybody. I wanted to deal next with the issue of professional self-regulation. Those are two important terms. What does a profession mean, and what does self-regulation mean? I want to take you through some of that and some of the basic sort of background in public policy, if you like. There's been some research done on what actually a profession is, and you can see the list of things that are involved in that include work that we do in PIBC, that work that you will do in your education and in your continuing development. And so these are the features that you will find in being as part of being a member of the professional planning profession. Important elements here are things like professional development, which you're engaging in today, the idea of having a professional society, which has to promote the welfare of the profession, and the code of ethics, which we'll spend some more time on too. So I've characterized essentially what the Planning Institute and other professional organizations do is exercise power, and power in our society flows ultimately from the democratically elected people. But over the centuries, there's been an evolution with respect to professions that allows a level of self-government and self-administration. This goes back to medieval times when the guilds were seen as exercising important functions with respect to the conduct of basic occupations such as masonry, bricklaying, and stonework. So I characterize this as a deal between the society, or basically government, and the professions. Society allows professions to limit entry, which we do in PIBC through our membership process, and it allows the profession to administer self-discipline to maintain standards of performance for designated professions. In return for that power, the professions have a responsibility and are expected to establish qualifications and conditions for entry and for continuation in the profession, establish a complaints process that's open to anybody, the public in particular, and establish a disciplinary process when something goes wrong. The deal can be withdrawn, and I think the best, a couple of examples here. I spent 5 years with the Homeowner Protection Office dealing with licensed residential builders. It was a system that was set up after the leaky condo disaster, when government decided that they could not allow the building profession to continue in an unregulated process. So there was, through that whole process, our dealing with the issues and the views of the building profession that they can and should undertake self-regulation. More recently, in 2016, the provincial government withdrew the right of realtors to self-regulate after they had that function for 10 years. I think that then Premier Clark's comments at that time are quite instructive. The industry's self-regulating body has failed to protect the public from cutthroat and illegal practices and has lost the public's confidence in its ability to police itself. No profession wants to get itself into a position where that can be said of it, where a government can take that kind of action. And it is the individuals as well as the collective performance that would avoid or lead to that kind of situation. So that's why we all have responsibilities as individual members of the profession to uphold standards of professionalism and conduct. More recently, the Real Estate Council was restructured, and its responsibilities were reduced. They introduced some concepts which I think are important and in fact are relevant to PIBC. Non-realtor representatives on the governing body, more than half in that case. A new superintendent with the responsibility for rulemaking and administering a code of conduct and a code of ethics and professional conduct. The significant penalties for breaking the rules, and those were increased from fines from $10,000 to $250,000, commissions to be returned. We will all recall that the ability of buyers and sellers to be represented by a single agent was eliminated. So there were a number of changes that were made as part of that government response, the public sector response to a profession which had lost its ability or lost the public's confidence in its ability to administer itself. The deal can be restructured. Again, we operate under provincial legislation. In 2018, there was a professional reliance review panel set up basically after the Mount Poly Dam collapse disaster, and they established a new act governing initially the societies and self-governing professions that were involved in the administration of land hazards, and they included the foresters, engineers, and geoscientists, the applied science technologists, agrologists, applied biologists. But others can be added to this framework. It establishes a new superintendent of professional regulation as an overseer, as part of government, and expectations for public representation, competency, all of the things that we'll talk about today. So that is an illustration of how that deal can be restructured, and it's open for professions such as the planning profession to become or not to become part of that, and that is certainly something that would require some careful consideration. So this is a wake-up call for the professions that are out there that are still self-regulating under more informal arrangements.
Thanks,
So,
Ken. So the next section we want to cover the PIBC's Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which is the bedrock of how we self-regulate ourselves under the deal that we have with the provincial government as a professional society. What I am going to do is try to give you a sense of what the big ideas are in the code, rather than the specific line-by-line kind of review, because there's just too much content to cover. But hopefully this will provide you with the framework that when you go to look at the code again, you'll remember how these principles and big ideas flow through. And I have combined some of the sections, some of the line-by-lines for brevity, so just so you know that. PIBC's code is a bylaw of the Planning Institute. It has two sections, a code of ethics, which is more aspirational, it's a set of values, if you like, and a code of professional conduct, which is quite directional, 35 statements, as I mentioned. The code of professional conduct is actually was produced by the Canadian Institute of Planners and provides that consistency across Canada, which I think is a highly valuable element for planners across the country, and for the public to be able to expect that from the planning profession across the country. Both codes are enforceable in British Columbia. The core concepts in the Code of Ethics are competency and integrity, and you will find this in most professional codes, but in our Planning Institute code, competency is essentially defined as knowing the skills and abilities needed for your area of practice and being able to apply those skills successfully. Integrity is defined as having a keen sense of responsibility to the profession employers and the public, and retaining a sense of independence so that you can exercise your professional judgment without bias. Those are incredibly important concepts: competency and integrity. The values in the Code of Ethics are, I've summarized them into these 4 boxes here. They are practicing sustainable planning, considering the needs of today and future generations, valuing natural and human environments and considering the interactions between them, acknowledging cross-boundary effects as well, fostering meaningful participation by all segments of society, and balancing community and individual interests. By including these values in the code, PIBC is saying that these are the values that professional planners are working to achieve in their day-to-day practice. Turning now to the Code of Professional Conduct, it has principles for conduct in dealing with 3 major categories: the public and the public interest, your employer or client, and the profession, other fellow professionals, assistants, students, the institute, etc. So let's take a look at these in turn. In terms of your responsibility, our responsibility collectively to the public interest, you'll see that 3 of these bullets, the first, third, and fourth, have some resonance with the values in PIBC's Code of Ethics, respecting diversity of needs, values, and aspirations, and encouraging discussion of those, acknowledging the interrelated nature of planning decisions for human and natural environments, and providing opportunities for meaningful participation and for education. The fourth bullet that is found in this section of responsibility to the public interest is about providing full, clear, accurate information in a timely way. There's also a section that talks about recognizing an employer's right to confidentiality. So you can see some of the tension that can arise for planners in your professional day-to-day lives. But the code really does provide some guidance on this. Turning then to what are our responsibilities to our employers or clients. The first 2 are about that competency and integrity notion that I talked about earlier, providing your independent professional opinion. When you're hired as a planner, you're hired for your expertise and your ability to provide that expertise in an unbiased and professional way. You're also expected to work within your competency with integrity and professionalism, to always be prepared, to be diligent. Those 2 bullets speak to competency and integrity. The next 4 bullets have more to do with conflict of interest. And so I'll just, this is an area we're going to spend a little bit more time on later on in the examples section, because it is an area that's not really well understood, apparently. But we thought we would just talk about these 4 bullets a little bit before we move on. A very important piece: do not accept or offer inducements that could appear to influence professional advice. And there's appear to influence is a key factor there, a key phrase. It does not have to influence, it only has to appear to influence professional advice, and you would be in breach of the code if you did something like that. You have to acknowledge the values of your employer and respect their right to confidentiality unless they conflict with the PIBC code. So you can see the PIBC code is telling you that code, for you as a professional, that code takes precedence over the values of your employer. However, if you are in a situation where you're in a conflict with your employer's values and expectation of confidentiality. You have your duty under our code is to inform in a timely way your employer or your client of any potential conflicts with the code and what their interests are. And the last bullet in this section is only work for one employer, obviously, on any particular planning issue. You can't represent both sides of the coin in the same way that dual agency for realtors is no longer allowed. The final group of responsibilities that we have in the Code of Professional Conduct is to the profession and other members of the profession. And this is a dense section of the code, I would say, which I've summarized into the following bullets. Obviously, we have to keep our knowledge up to date. Do not sign off on work you have not checked. When you look at other codes, for example, the engineers, this is a very prominent code and a condition in their codes, and I think it's becoming increasingly important in the planning profession as well. Don't advertise services outside your area of competency. Don't promise to do work that you are not trained to do in the planning field. Be fair and objective. If you're looking at another planner's work, do not act maliciously towards other members or colleagues or their work. Don't try to steal anybody's job or contract, turning out of the, and don't engage in any questionable conduct in any aspect of your life. So you're expected, as a member of the profession, to always conduct yourself in a professional way. And remember that you're always representing the planning profession, no matter, even in your private activities. PIBC doesn't want you to speak for them, obviously, in public, unless you're authorized to do so. And then very importantly, you're required to deal with ethics responsibly, ethics and professional conduct, and that includes a duty to report any unethical or unprofessional behavior of another member, to comply with any requests from PIBC for information about an ethical or professional conduct issue, including related to a disciplinary process, if you're asked to participate in a disciplinary process. And you must respect the process and the decision of any review or disciplinary process. So that provides an overview of the code, the big ideas in the code, competency, integrity, and a set of duties to the public interest, to our employers and clients, and to the profession itself. So now Ken's going to take us through, pardon me, some of the issues that can arise when, if you find yourself in a difficult situation.
So yes, we've laid out, I guess, the landscape of the expectations of the profession and the institute. That we now look at the issue of how, or matters of how, those intersect with daily life. And we want to talk about, first, about some issues that have come up where the provisions that we talked about interface with actual daily practice, and then talk about the complaints process and how, then use some specific examples. So these are the kinds of ethical and professional challenges that have come up in our experience with administering the Code of Professional Conduct. They're all, I guess what I'd say about these is that they're really, they assist in you in being clear about your responsibilities as a client or as a professional to a client or an employer. So for example, the idea of independent judgment, the fact that you are paid and expected to exercise your independent judgment, that when an employer or client tries to tell you what your judgment should be, that is not in the interests of you as a professional or in the interests of your client. Failure to disclose conflicts and perceptions, behaving with professional integrity, aspects of one's life, both private and public, not showing sufficient regard for social and environmental impacts and long-range consequences. And I think our profession in particular, I think, has a responsibility to future generations and to others who are not at the decision-making table. So that's part of your responsibility. Not providing timely and adequate information, which becomes very important as issues get to the formal stage of public hearings and litigation. The information that has been provided to the decision makers and the responsibility of the professional in that process has some ethical dimensions to it. Misrepresentation of information, which is so easy to do these days with all the electronic assistance that we have, and putting pressure on others to come to a conclusion that may or may not be substantiated, and having consultation processes that appear to be comprehensive, but in fact leave out significant people or interest in the process. So those are the kinds of the ways in which you can get this interaction between the principles of the code and actual daily behavior. Issues will generate complaints to PIBC, and they can be made by anybody. They can be made by a member of the public or a member of council or a citizens group. Everyone has that right to make a complaint to PIBC about a member's conduct. The categories that usually arise here are the conduct of the member and providing that advice, non-disclosure, accepting inducement, improper criticism of another member's work, or providing advice outside the member's own expertise. So these are some of the areas in which we have found that complaints arrive at the PIBC office, and when they do, they must be dealt with. There's no choice as far as the institute is concerned. It must examine any complaint that comes in, and this is the process. Starting with the intake, the institute then appoints a couple of members to act as case officers to look into their professionals, to look into the complaint. The member is informed, which is, I think, important for us as members to realize that when something does come in, we have the right to be informed of it in a timely way. The member also has the right to respond to the complaint, to provide their side of the story, if you like, and that provides the basis for an investigation by the case officers who prepare a report and recommendations to the Professional Conduct Review Committee and the chair of the committee. The chair then has some options there in terms of how to handle the complaint, either take no further action if he or she finds it to be unfounded, to try to arrange a consent discipline process, which is a discipline process that answers and satisfies the complainant and is accepted and acceptable to the member, or if the matter cannot be resolved through those processes, then to go on to the process of a review hearing. And that's when the lawyers get involved and things start to get very complicated and expensive. So there's an effort, or at least a system that's intended to try and resolve issues at a less formal level if possible. Consequences of discipline would be a written reprimand of the member. These are not mutually exclusive. That can include an apology from the member, mandatory training or counseling, a written public notice about the member that will be published in some publication, suspension of membership, financial penalty up to $10,000, ultimately loss of your membership in PIBC, and payment to the PIBC of the costs of a hearing if such a hearing is required. So now, Nancy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Ken. So we thought it would be interesting and useful for us to go through a few case studies and of cases that have been investigated and what the issues were and how they were resolved. And we decided to focus on conflict of interest. As I mentioned earlier, it's an area that does not seem to be well understood and is often raised as an issue in a complaint. So we have 4 examples we'll go through before we open up the floor to you for questions. Just before I dive into those examples, we just wanted to talk a little bit about what is conflict of interest. It arises when a professional's judgment and recommendations are perceived to be or are influenced by personal interests in the particular situation or case. Under the PIBC code, the onus is on the PIBC member to recognize and to disclose to their client or employer fully and in a timely way a possible conflict of interest arising from the member's private interests or activities. It is not your job as the member to decide what to do about a conflict or to decide actually even if you are fully in a conflict situation. Your job is to recognize that you may have a conflict and to disclose that in a timely way and fully and timely. It is the job of your employer or your client to decide how they want to address the potential conflict that you've raised with them. It is not your job. You do not decide to recuse yourself. That is not your job under the PIBC code. It's the job of your employer or client. They may decide to ask you to recuse yourself from a particular file. They may decide to give the file to someone else. They may decide to ask you to make a public statement about a potential conflict and carry on. There's lots of choices that can be made there. But the key thing is you need to disclose. And I would recommend to you, having dealt with some of these cases in the Professional Conduct Review Committee, that you document that. You need to document these kinds of things so that you have a record of that disclosure. We also wanted to make the point that conflicts themselves are not a breach of the code. Not disclosing the conflict is the breach. We all have many different roles in our lives, and sometimes they intersect and overlap. And so it would be unusual to never have a conflict arise where your private interests are overlapping with your professional responsibilities. So just remember that your duty is to disclose in an early and timely way. And even if you think it might be a conflict, it's still your duty to disclose. We wanted to close off this discussion of conflict of interest just by reiterating an undisclosed conflict that then led to a breach of a member's responsibility to provide demonstrably impartial professional advice and recommendations may be much more serious than a failure to disclose that possible conflict of interest when it first arises. So it's way better to disclose. Let's look at the 4 case studies now. This one was reported in the Planning West. It's from the Planning Institute of BC. It's reported in Planning West in the winter 2017 edition of that journal. It is from an example from municipal government, and the complaint was received from a member of the Institute about another member. The complaint was that a planning director in a municipality took concert tickets and a parking pass from a developer when that developer had work and permits underway in the municipality for which the planning director worked, and that presented a real or perceived conflict that was not disclosed. The process went fully to the review hearing stage with the member against whom the complaint was made offering the defense that this was not a problem within the municipality that the member worked for, that this was there was no municipal policy that prevented it, and therefore the member had done nothing wrong. It took until the 11th hour at the review hearing for the two lawyers to get together and offer a consent discipline solution, which the review panel considered and essentially approved, and that the consequences were a written reprimand to the member, acknowledgement, a written apology from the member to the Institute that acknowledged the breaches, which included non-recognition of the breach of the code and the appearance of a potential perceived conflict of interest and potential bias in planning advice being offered. The case was published, and there was also a fine of $1,500 contributed towards recovery of the Institute's costs in this case. We wanted to point out there's a few lessons here. One is that accepting an inducement is clearly a breach of the code, that municipal policy does not override the code. That is should be very clear to everyone, but wasn't. And just third, we believe that earlier resolution to this issue was possible. It didn't have to go all the way to the review hearing. So that's our first example from the about conflict of interest, a complaint and how it was dealt with. The second example is also from the Planning Institute, from also in a municipal setting. This complaint actually came from the municipal council. And it is an interesting one, we believe. It was a senior person in a management role in a planning department, employed by a municipality, who entered negotiations with a consulting firm that was providing consulting services to the municipality where the planner was working and seeking to provide additional services longer term. There was no disclosure of the possible conflict at the time the negotiations were underway. This began in 2007 and was not disclosed until 2009, when the planner actually had an accepted offer of employment with the consulting firm, and it under questioning, it came up that the planner had been in these negotiations for several years. The council proceeded to make the complaint to the Institute. So this is another one that also went all the way to the review hearing, and at the 11th hour had a consent discipline proposal reviewed by the review hearing panel, and there was an admission. The agreed discipline was admission of the breach of the code, a reprimand, written reprimand, publication in Planning West, and a $2,500 fine. The planner, the member who was the subject of the complaint, argued that he just didn't recognize that he was in a conflict of interest when he was negotiating a new employment arrangement with the consulting firm, and was not trying to deliberately hide that from the council, but nonetheless he was found to be in a very serious breach of the code of conflict. And that was reported in the spring 2011 version of edition of Planning West, if you want to go and have a look at that one. Our next example is, that's the Planning West. Our next example is from Ontario, the Ontario Planners Institute, OPPI, Ontario Professional Planning Institute, where this is from the consulting world, where a planner working for a consulting firm started a competing independent consulting firm secretly, while he was still working at the employer's firm, and redirected work and fees to his own firm, contrary to his professional responsibilities, creating potential conflicts for his clients and a number of other unfortunate situations. So this was deemed to be a very serious breach of the code, and the fellow's membership was revoked. A $5,000 fine was instituted, and OPPI published the case and named the member. It was a very serious issue of deliberate conflict of interest and essentially pilfering work from your employer. The last example we want to look at on conflict of interest today is also from the Ontario Professional Planning Institute, and it's one that looks at multiple roles, and we thought this was useful because we all do have multiple roles generally in our lives. In this example, a planner who worked as a planning consultant independently, so not for a firm, just for himself. And he also was acting as a builder/developer. He was elected as a school board official and also an appointed member of a conservation authority in Ontario, all within the same geographic area. So a lot of potential for overlap and conflict between the various responsibilities that this member had taken on. A complaint was made, and the Ontario Professional Planning Institute, because there was no employer in this case, OPPI essentially took the role of the employer of this independent planning consultant and specifically gave direction to this planner about how to deal with the conflict of interest situations that he had placed himself into. He was admonished from working on certain projects at all, directed to disclose conflicts to certain clients, and to hire a project manager for others. And the Ontario Planning Institute published that case anonymously. So now it's your turn, and we would encourage you to submit your questions. We'll do our best to provide some feedback. We'd like to take about half an hour for this session, and then we'll close off with some advice for you going forward. So I'm just going to put up the question card that we had before, and once again, we'd like to encourage you to use the confidential way of submitting your questions if you don't want everybody to see your question, because what we have found in our experience is people want to ask a sensitive question that is actually about a current work situation they have, and they are reluctant to have that shared broadly. So we don't specifically read them out or who they came from or anything like that. So use that message to host, is it, Sophie? Presenters, and it'll come through just to Ken and I, and we will have a look at them. So before we, as we're waiting for people to send in their questions, we do have a couple of examples of situations that we've had in the past that tend to come up almost every time. And the first one is, what about chocolates at Christmas? Received by a local government planning office from the development community, and it makes people feel slightly uncomfortable to have these boxes boxes of chocolates, wrapped baskets coming in, and it feels like an inducement. And the answer is yes, it is an inducement, and you should. And so then the question is, what do you do with it? Do you return it, or what are your options? And we've heard of a number of different ideas which we'll offer up. One is to put those gifts out in the public area of your municipal office, where the public actually can access them, and include the card of the company that provided the gift. That is one way to be more transparent and to not feel to deflect the issue of planning department planners accepting inducements from developers. Another
and in the context of that, to have some communication with the giver, and to indicate that this is something that is not welcome, that you appreciate the sentiment behind it, but it's not expected or in fact welcome. And also, if you've taken that kind of action and put the chocolates out with the developer's card, let the developer or whoever's given the chocolates know about that. So in other words, there's disclosure here. We received these things from you. We would hope you won't do it in the future. In the meantime, we've taken what you've given us and identified it with you and put it out in a public area, which I think is a way of communicating a message without being rude, because nobody wants to appear ungrateful.
And another way that we had another groups suggest that how they've been handling it is to auction off inside the planning department, to auction off the basket of goods and then donate the funds that are raised to charity. And we wouldn't recommend that, because it still is benefiting an individual planner or a planning department or group of planners. Even though the money is going to charity, it still creates that perception of influence and bias. So that's a fairly common kind of question that we get, and Ken often points out that it used to be wine or it used to be whiskey that would show up, which is even somewhat more challenging. And I mean, I know that I've had this situation in places where I've worked, and the staff kind of treat you as a bit of a Grinch for putting it out in the public area. But I think for all of our professional integrity, that's really the best thing to do. And as Ken said, to make sure you have contact with the giver and just really help them understand that this is just not something that fits with our professional code of conduct and our responsibilities as a self-regulating profession.
I think it also goes to the question of creating a culture. If you in a management position, you take a stand on this, it's not going to be a lot of fun, but it'll be easier to do the next time around, and over time, the word will get around that this kind of thing is not helpful, not part of the relationship between private citizens or employers and the public planner.
So another one that we get to.
The one about questionable conduct. I think it's that's.
I think that's questionable conduct in any part of your life. There was a question, it's a general question, I think everybody can see it, which is in the code. It states that planners should refrain from questionable conduct in all aspects of their lives. And remember, you're representing the Professional Planning Institute no matter where you are. One example, I guess, of questionable conduct is breaking the law. And we have had a member of the Institute had his membership revoked for breaking the law. He was breaking the law on the job by accepting bribes or asking for bribes. And he's no longer a member of the Institute. So there's an example of, from a real case of questionable conduct.
The question was questionable conduct according to whom and based on what? And there I think the primary reference point has to be the code. And one of our themes here is the code of professional conduct that the Institute has. We've worked with it for many years. It is extremely well done. It's very comprehensive, and I won't say it's like the Bible, but it certainly has answers to many of the questions that you might have. So I think that's a key reference point if we get to that. The other question that had come up here was what happens when there's a values conflict between two I don't know.
Sorry,
Okay.
I changed you. I
Yeah,
changed
you
it
did.
on you. Sorry.
Between I think it was about
Two professionals working on
one
the
of
same
whom's in
file.
a management
Yeah.
position.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a very good example. The code is your friend in a situation like that. You can invite, and it's not disrespectful or insubordination to talk to a professional, even if they're in a senior position, about the way in which their conduct and your conduct fits within the code. So it allows you to export the issue, if you like, to an objective process or objective document, and invite the other person to consider their conduct in relation to the code. Ultimately, of course, and it has happened, one member may file a complaint to the Institute about the behavior of another, and that person the second person may be in a management position. And there can be some uncomfortable moments created by that, but there's nothing in the code or in the conditions of membership that prevents one from doing that. And it's an avenue that in some cases may be beneficial to both parties.
Yes, this is another fairly common question that arises in our sessions, which is my boss asked me to change the recommendation, told me to find a way to make this work. Often it's the city manager that is hearing from council that they want to see a project proceed, but it's not consistent with council policies, it's not consistent with the public input that's being received, any number of things, and the planner feels very uncomfortable in actually recommending it and believes that it would be against the PIBC code to do so. And this is a case where you do have to think ahead quite a bit in terms of what the consequences are, but certainly one, a stepwise approach is always useful. If you go to, no, please don't do that. If you go to try to find out exactly why there's an interest in having the project proceed, and maybe there's another way to skin the cat, and resolve the concerns that you have. If you have a broader understanding, sometimes that does happen. But in the end, if you feel that very strongly that you cannot support it, then you have to say that doing so would be against your requirements to comply with the code, and that you can't have your name on the report. And that can be a career limiting move in some respects, but it also can be a very freeing move in other respects, because I am telling you that there are a number of situations that I've been part of and have seen where people want something done, and the planner recommends it, and then the stuff hits the fan, and it's the planner's reputation and integrity that is affected by that reaction, not the people who ask for you to change it. And so, you know, be very, very careful of having political direction override your sense of what is professional conduct in any particular case. So we've had several questions come in along that kind of line today. And so we're hoping that that provides you with some helpful guidance. It's also a very, very common question when Ken and I give this seminar in other settings, and we can't see you today, but we can see people when we're in a room, and we see all kinds of eyes rolling and shrugs and nods. And so I think it is something that everybody has to deal with from time to time. And but it does. I think the code does provide you with fairly clear guidance, and it can be freeing. We did have one director of planning from a small municipality in BC say that every time her city manager asked her to approve something and support something, she would say, "I cannot do that," and she was still working at that municipality. So it's not always the end of your career at that particular location.
So what about the example of the person who lives in a city that they grew up in and wanted to know about what information they can provide to people that they know in the community?
Yes, and so publicly provided information that's available publicly, I think is fine. But any interpretation of the information, and I think you're starting to cross the line. And you would be much better to route that inquiry through a coworker than to handle it yourself. And it just is a much better course of action for you to protect both yourself and your friend or friends in terms of any potential questions of bias or uneven access to information that can arise down the road. And this is another question that does come up. For example, in terms of multiple roles and responsibilities, both of us have been on nonprofit boards, and these days, of course, nonprofits are responsible for raising quite a bit of money to fund their own operations. The days of operating grants are long behind us. And you can be asked to use your reputation and connections and position to help advance a fundraising objective by going to meetings, for example. So if you're a municipal planner and you're going to meetings with the developer and asking for money for a nonprofit, I would be very, very careful about doing that. In fact, I would recommend not doing it, because you're putting yourself in a position where there could be an expectation of a friendly review or more access to information or just any number of things from that company that might do a donation to the nonprofit group that you're on the board of. So there's an example of, be very, very thoughtful about what is your primary role and how do you protect your integrity in that role.
The question to this is up above.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah. I think we've covered that. Thank you. So while we wait for some other people to put in some additional questions. Oh, I see. Sorry, guys. we're not used to this kind of technical approach.
So if you do complain about a coworker, can you be in a conflict of interest if you don't disclose that you have complained? I think you would be in violation of the code. Sorry, if you do complain, you're not required to disclose that you have complained to the worker or to the other member.
No.
So that's not, and there's no conflict of interest there. So you have the right, anybody has the right to make a complaint to the Institute and have it treated confidentially. Right?
Yes, although as a case officer, you do provide a copy of the complaint usually to the member so that they can provide a competent response. And so generally, members do know who have complained about them. I think if I was in a position where I was going to make a complaint about a member that I worked with, I would have already discussed my concerns with the member, and I probably would tell them that I had lodged a complaint. Not before, but after, because before it looks like you're trying to threaten them to change the behavior. I think you do that afterwards, and you say I've put a complaint in, and it just keeps information completely transparent, and I think in these kinds of processes that's better. But it is your option, I believe. They will find out. There's only cases where it's treated confident. The process is confidential in that we don't talk about complaints outside of the case officer that's doing the case officers that are doing the investigation. So not even the entire committee that sits on the Professional Conduct Review Committee knows about the details of complaints. It's only when they are published that becomes more widely known, and sometimes they're published anonymously. It depends on the severity of the breaches of the code, whether or not the Institute decides that it wants to publish the name of the individual. Because sometimes these breaches, as you know, they shouldn't be ruining a person's career for life, and publishing a name of an individual would have a tendency to be quite damaging for a very long period of time. So, that part of the confidentiality of the process is quite strict, but between a complainant and a member, there is a dialogue, if you like, through the case officer of what is the complaint, what is the response. The person making the complaint is usually apprised of the response, if not during the case officer's investigation, certainly at the close of the investigation, where people are provided with either a copy of the case officer's report or a summary of the report and the recommendations. So people are well aware on both the complainant and the member side of how the conduct of the review and the assessment is going. We have another question about someone has said that I have a partner whose company bids and works on developments that I'm processing, and I live in a small town. So this is quite close in terms of benefit, right? I disclose to my employer, we avoid talking about things in the project that are outside of what's publicly available. Is there anything else that should be done? And I would say no. I think you've disclosed your potential conflict of interest. If your employer has decided that you should continue to process the applications, then you've done your duty as to the code, the Institute's code, and there would be no basis for a complaint, unless, of course, somebody finds that you're providing biased professional opinions.
But it does go to something we'll touch on in the closing part of it, which is thinking ahead. If you are if thinking about situations or actions you can take that will avoid the creation of a conflict or an apparent conflict or an issue. So over time, those are things to keep in mind as, for example, the individual's business expands and develops, and as the individual member carries on with their career.
We've had a question come in to the general section about what is our duty to report concerns with other professions, so architects, engineers, arborists, for example. If you have a concern about their the professionalism of their advice that they're providing. We've had a question like this actually at the Kelowna conference several years ago, Ken, so you answered it then. And do you want to take it now?
Having a senior's moment.
It was about the wall. Remember the construction of the walls and the engineers that were signing off on retaining walls?
I think each of the professions have their own processes for dealing with issues that arise in terms of ethical conduct, and as professionals or as members of the public, we've got the ability to, where those processes exist, we've got the ability to make a complaint or to identify to a member that an issue in relation to their code may be created by some activity.
So your duty is, if you're concerned about something, and as a professional you're concerned about something, I think you do have a duty to make a complaint to that about that professional to their organization. But that's about that's what you would be expected to do, I think.
Yeah.
A question has come in about what does the Institute do about non-members who are practicing as planners and who are demonstrating unprofessional behavior that wouldn't be consistent with the code? And this is a challenge. We can only discipline and investigate members who are members of the Planning Institute of BC. Our powers do not extend beyond membership, so there is no formal process for addressing those matters. I would say that there would be informal channels to express concerns and point out where issues are happening that wouldn't be consistent with the professional code of planners. But the Institute has no ability to investigate or reprimand non-members. So sometimes we get complaints about councils, for example, who are, according to the complainant, are making bad planning decisions. But of course, the councils are generally not members of the Planning Institute. Council members are not members of the Planning Institute, and therefore a complaint is not non-actionable.
I think the code is a reference point, though, for general behavior, and if there's always an opportunity to say this, but basically a member can say, I'm a member of the Planning Institute, and I have this code that I follow, and if the individual in question were a member of the Planning Institute, they would be in violation of that code. Not a particularly polite or happy conversation to have, but it does go to the question of public expectations of people who are doing professional planning work. It's also the kind of issue that the PIBC Council, I'm sure, will be considering as we go forward. as to how big a problem it is, how big a problem there is arising from the fact that there are a number of people practicing planning in British Columbia who are not members of PIBC, and what the consequences for society, but also for the reputation of members of the Professional Institute are from misbehavior on the part of people in those roles.
So we encourage you, we've got another few minutes we can spend on this section. Encourage you to shoot us a question if you have one that you're just thinking about putting in. We have time to address it if you'd like. And while we're waiting, we have another set of situations that commonly come up, which is about lunches, shall we say, doing lunch. And in this day and age, everyone's encouraged to have great relationships with everyone, with your colleagues, with your bosses, with your subordinates, with the development community. If you're working in a municipality, if you're in the consulting field, you're encouraged to have great relationships with the planners working in the local government or the government sector. And one of the ways that you build relationships is by doing lunch or drinks after work or other things like that. And so we often do have questions about how do you as a planner protect your integrity in those kinds of situations. So as a local government planner, pay for yourself. And I would also say limit your exposure to any particular group. One of the pieces of advice that I often give is publish your calendar, particularly if you're a more senior member of the municipal staff. Make your calendar available to folks, anybody in the public to see, so that there's transparency around who you're having lunch with or drinks after work, and make sure that they're in the calendar and not forgotten. And that goes to some way to removing the appearance of any kind of influence or bias that might arise from these kinds of social occasions. We have had people say, but I have a good pal that I went to school with who works in the consulting business, and I'm in the local government, we play hockey together. Why can't we just, we have dinner together, where families are close, et cetera, and, those are tough situations, but, in the end, you need to make sure that you're protecting your integrity, and depending on your level of responsibility, I think in an organization, if you are a more senior person or a person in charge of recommending approvals on particular development applications, I think you need to be very careful about your associations to protect your integrity.
And I think people here, who are in further along in their careers, need to be aware that expectations are changing, and letting a private individual buy you lunch 15 or 20 years ago wouldn't have raised any eyebrows, or might not have created any issues. But in fact, the expectations are getting more strong for clarity, transparency, for your ability to recognize and establish that you are truly impartial. So it's a fluid process, and I think that's something that we need to, particularly those of you who are in mid-career or later on in your career, recognizing that norms are in transition, and don't get caught out by changes in norms because of things are done differently from when you started out.
Yes, and I think back to some of the Christmas parties that have been sponsored by the development industry in Vancouver area. and everybody goes and has a great time. But you know what? Members of the community are never invited to those sessions. And I think you have to ask yourself, if a community member that I deal with or that has rallied around a development proposal to speak against a development proposal knew or saw me at those kinds of events, what would they think? What would they think about my ability to impartially, professionally, without bias, analyze and make recommendations about a particular project or a particular set of policies? It's a very, it's a sticky wicket, and we would recommend that you be extremely careful around these matters.
Email.
What email addresses? So we can do that.
No.
I can't read it, it's too small.
That's too
Sorry,
small.
yeah.
There's also one about special considerations for sole proprietors versus being incorporated.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess on this one, I don't know that your legal status as a consultant makes a difference to your responsibilities under the code. I think the example that we gave from the Ontario Planning Institute, where you had a sole proprietor essentially who had multiple roles, who didn't disclose potential conflicts of interest that should have been disclosed, probably because he didn't know to whom. I think in that case, he didn't think there were any, didn't recognize, which is also a very important part of that section of the code. You have to recognize that you have a potential conflict of interest in addition to disclosing it. But whether you're a sole proprietor or working in or incorporated, I don't think the code doesn't differentiate on your responsibilities for practice.
But an individual who is the sole proprietor is governed by the code, and it's maybe a little bit more diffuse, if you like, when the person is part of or when there's a corporation involved, because they're not members of the institute. So the question, I think, really comes back to the individual responsibility of the member of the planning institute, whether they are a sole proprietor or an employee of a company or employee of a municipality.
Certainly true. We have another question that's come in about conferences and attending conferences where there's a hospitality room, for example, that's put on by a firm and everything's free. There's food and beverages, and it's an opportunity to have some fun and meet people and chat it up. And certainly we've all been to these, and I guess I'm not sure that I would say you shouldn't go, but I would say that you should limit your time there. And certainly, if anybody ever approached you with a question about a particular project that was underway in your municipality, I'm assuming this is a local government question, then you would quickly inform that person that you're not there, you're there purely in a social perspective and you can't speak about any current or potential applications, and make an appointment during office hours, which would show up on your calendar to discuss any particular questions about a project. I mean, we don't want to be complete Grinches and say you can't ever go to anything, but you do need to be very thoughtful about these hospitality, gift, inducement types of situations. They definitely occur, and they can be a real mark, black mark on your integrity. So I think that looks like we have used up all of the questions that we have from our audience today.
Nancy and Ken, we did get a few questions sent to me by email, And what I will do is when I send out the recording link and PDF slides, I will also put on your contact information and perhaps let you answer the question privately with that person.
Okay,
Okay.
we can do that. Sorry,
Okay.
I was over there. There we go.
So just to close this, we wanted to offer a little bit of advice. Some of these things we've touched on already, but things to keep in mind as you go forward. We hope this will be useful to you. Obviously, prevention is much to be preferred to trying to cure problems. So, thinking ways of avoiding ethical problems is an important thing we would recommend that you do. Nancy's already referred to the situations we've both had where we've been involved with other associations or other roles, even the Planning Institute for that matter, where you need to think before you're asked or before you decide to become involved in something as to whether look down the line and see whether that might present some kind of issues for you going forward into the future. So keeping those roles and associations clear and thinking ahead about them are two things that I think are, from our experience, well worth doing. We've already mentioned the code and how much wisdom it has to offer and how much guidance it can provide and how helpful it can be in deflecting some inappropriate pressures that you might face in the workplace, and it can assist in all kinds of ways. So it's important to keep current on the code and to seek advice based on on the code from the Institute. If there is advice available from the Institute or from other professionals, again, having the code as a reference point provides a basis for a conversation that can be perhaps a little less awkward than it might be if you weren't doing it in that context. Also suggest that you consider applying the newspaper test, which was recommended to me by the Treasurer of Ontario when I worked for him as an executive assistant, and I had an issue and a question for him. He said, "Ken, you have to see it on the front page of the Globe and Mail, reported in the worst possible context, and still feel comfortable with what you've done. And if you can't pass that test, then don't do it," which leads me to the last avoidance strategy here. If in doubt, if your spidey sense is telling you that there's something a little bit funny about something, don't do it. If you do get in the glue, and we hope you don't, then there are some things, and I think one of the things that I've noticed in looking at some of the cases that we've dealt with is the behavior of the member in the initial shock of a complaint that often compounds the problems or may compound the problems for them. So it's important to be very clear-headed if something like this arises. Know that you will be informed of the complaint by the Institute. Know that you will be given a chance to defend yourself. And in that context, don't lie. Don't belittle the issue or the person or question the motives of the person who is making the complaint, whether you know who they are or not. Nancy's already mentioned the importance of keeping very careful notes. Document as much as you can. I think in your life generally, I'd have to say, but particularly when you're in a situation where you think this might come back to be require some further examination, then your notes will be very important to you to avoid what I just referred to as seniors moments or lapses in memories. I mean, it's well known that people have different recollections of the same events, so your notes can help you a great deal in that process. Always show that your behavior is in advance of the public interest, that is your primary concern, that's how you've behaved and conducted yourself, and make that clear at every step of the way. Cooperate fully with the investigations. Don't hide